This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Welcome to the seminar. As you will have known, because you wouldn't have come otherwise, Caitriona Beaumont is going to talk to us, and she's got a nice long title.
Very long title.
Which I'm not going to read out because I don't think I need to. But we're delighted to have Kate with us and look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you. Thank you all very much for coming. And yeah, I've tweaked with the title a wee bit, so sorry about that. I know how annoying it is, but I have broadened it out somewhat to make it even longer than it was originally. So I think I won the record for the longest title this year. Anyway, that was my ambition. So I'm just going to not focus. I will be speaking quite a lot about the interwar years, but I broadened it out a bit more just to take in some of the broader history of the organisation. Right, so the history of the women's movement in Britain in the decades following the 1928 Equal Franchise Act has featured a wide range of women's organisations and key campaigns. These histories include post-suffrage feminist societies, women's sections of the established political parties, women's citizens' associations, and working class women's organisations such as the Women's Co-operative Guild. More recently, this scholarship has expanded to include a wider variety of women's groups, including professional societies, religious groups, and mainstream voluntary women's organisations. As Kirsta Cowman has observed, the inclusion of a more diverse range of women's organisations, some openly rejecting a traditional feminist agenda, has broadened the size and the scope of the interwar women's movement considerably. And in my own work on the history of housewives associations, I've argued that organisations not self-identifying as feminist or acknowledging the existence of patriarchy should not be thought of as part of a feminist movement. Nevertheless, these organisations did acknowledge the rights of women as equal citizens, and this was particularly the case after 1918 and 1928, when women in Britain were awarded the parliamentary franchise. So these organisations also engaged in voluntary action to enhance women's lives. Therefore, I argue that our understanding of the term women's movement needs to be revised. We need to liberate it from an exclusive association with feminism. This allows the movement to be recast as a social movement encompassing all women's organisations, including feminist, political, religious, and conservative women's groups. So the aim of this paper is to argue that the YWCA, the Young Women's Christian Association, must also be added to this larger group of organisations, which together, I would argue, made up the women's movement in 20th century Britain. In doing so, I'll focus on how the YWCA, I think I'm just going to say YW, just because it shortens that. So the YW promoted active citizenship amongst women and engaged in voluntary action to make women's lives better. It's puzzling that this argument still needs to be made, as the history of the YW in England and Wales shows it played a role in highlighting the importance of citizenship for women in the wake of the equal franchise. Moreover, its campaigning activities covered a wide and diverse range of issues. Yet still the YW doesn't feature in any major histories of the British women's movement. For example, in the work of Martin Pugh or in Sue Bruley, it doesn't warrant a mention. And I have to say, I have taken up the hobby of going straight to the index of books and seeing, are they there? And they aren't. They are in mine, I would say. This is despite the fact that its archive is easily accessible in the Modern Record Centre at the University of Warwick, so it's a really full, rich archive, so it's very accessible. This omission is even more surprising when one considers that the YWCA was recognised internationally as an international global organisation, and the history of the World YWCA and the YWCA in the US has been well documented. The YWCA's history in the US is particularly associated with challenging issues around race, and there's lots of work has been done on that. So I have asked myself, and one of the kind of questions I put out there on Twitter before the seminar was, well, why is it that the YW has been so neglected and overlooked in histories of the British women's movement? And I don't know if I have no evidence for the answer, but the only thing I can kind of guess or what I suspect is the case is the fact that the association eschewed equal rights feminism and was a conservative Christian organisation. In the past, these factors have undoubtedly resulted in historians making assumptions that this kind of organisation can possibly have contributed to a progressive women's movement. I hope I've now challenged this erroneous and somewhat patronising characterisation of religious women's groups, and this relates to my other work in showing that the Mothers' Union and the Catholic Women's League, and now the YW, all played their part in campaigning on behalf of women throughout the 20th century. So there's no doubt that the YW, in common with other large voluntary women's organisations, deliberately avoided public association with feminist ideology and feminist pressure groups. This was done primarily to protect the YW's status as a non-partisan, traditional and respectable Christian women's organisation. In the context of the interwar years, this was a tactical decision, as it shouldn't be forgotten that the terms feminist and feminism were often viewed in a pejorative way at this time. Plus ça change, some of you might think, but it certainly was the case in the interwar years. Feminist ideas were thought to be too radical, too political, and to pose a real threat to traditional family life. And Vera Brittain expressed this contemporary view when she remarked in 1928, and I quote, that feminists were often portrayed as spectacled, embittered women, disappointed, childless, dowdy, and generally unloved. This wasn't the image of women that the YWCA hoped to project. And just to give you an idea, this is a poster from 1919, if you can see there. So it's a very contrasting image with the dowdy, the speckled. Wrong with glasses, I have one here. Put them on presently. But you get the general idea. So instead, like other popular voluntary women's groups, the association sought to protect family life, the role of mothers within the home, and to support young women who worked before they got married. The leadership of the YW was acutely aware, therefore, that to maintain its membership and to continue its work providing practical and spiritual support to young women and girls, that it should not be too closely linked with feminist activism. So in the paper, I'm going to provide a brief history of the YW, because it, as I say, it so often has been neglected in the British context, and then move on to explore how the association promoted active citizenship and engaged in voluntary action during the interwar years. In terms of campaigns and due to time constraints, I'm just going to provide quite a brief overview of the voluntary action the YW engaged in during the interwar period and its war work, and then I'm going to focus in more detail on one key aspect of the YW's work, its determination to improve the working lives of women and its involvement in the Equal Pay Campaign. So the origins of the YWCA of Great Britain date back to 1877, when two nonconformist women's societies, a prayer union and a network of hostels for working girls, both first established in 1855. So one could argue that really it's 1855, but I've taken it from when they came together as the YWCA of Great Britain, it was 1877. And they merged to set up a new organisation. As the Times newspaper reported, the aim of this new organisation was to establish, under Christian influences, institutes for respectable young women to rest in, seek advice, and enjoy genial gatherings of various kinds. The new organisation was modelled on the YMCA, the Young Men's Christian Association, which was set up in 1844, and its aim was for the improvement of the spiritual and mental condition of young men. There were clear, close connections between the two groups. Just for example, Lady Mary Kinnard, a leading protagonist in the early development of the YWCA, was wife of Lord Kinnard, treasurer of the YMCA. By the end of 1878, 15 branches of the YWCA had been set up, and in 1885, a united central council was formed in London to coordinate the work of the organisation on a worldwide basis, and it becomes what we'd now term a global organisation from very early on. And so my slides were out of order. Let me go back. Whoops. There we go. So sorry, I'll read some of these, but that's just a copy from the Modern Record Centre of the objects from 1885. But I don't worry, I don't expect you to read those, unless you're all bespeckled, but not dowdy, I assure you. I'll read what they say. So, included amongst the objects of the YWCA was the desire, and I quote, to draw together for mutual help, sympathy and instruction young women of all classes, and to promote the moral, social and intellectual well-being of all through the various agencies. Providing friendship and protection to young women, especially those moving from the countryside to towns in search of work, was another primary objective. Membership was open to young women of any class who agreed to unite in prayer and place themselves under Christian influence. Two other categories of membership consisted of ladies in sympathy with the YWCA and willing to help in association work, and honorary associates, who were ladies expected to take a personal interest in the affairs of the association. This division of membership profiles signalled that the organisation was to be run by educated middle-class women interested in philanthropy who would offer practical advice and moral guidance to the younger, predominantly working-class girls. From its inception, the YW was an interdenominational and evangelical society. So by 1900, the YW had set up 1,700 branches in Britain, with a membership of some 94,000 women. As a society for young working women, the majority of whom were employed in factories or as domestic servants, the YWCA quickly developed an interest in working conditions. In 1886, the association had set up a factory helpers union with YWCA leaders visiting local factories to ensure the female employees were not subjected to either physical or moral abuse. During the early 1900s, it campaigned against the practice of sweated labour and the exploitation of home workers, calling for the introduction of a minimum wage for all women workers. It's early 1900s, so you can see it's really quite progressive, and yet they don't get mentioned in histories of labour law, as far as I am aware. In 1910, a social service council was convened to monitor employment and welfare legislation affecting women, as well as formulating national policy on industrial and social questions. There's little evidence to suggest that the YW actively supported the suffrage campaign and the suffrage movement throughout these years. This is most likely due to a perception that the campaign for the women's vote was a party political issue, and the fact that the association was divided on the question of female suffrage at this time. However, members were kept updated on the campaign and encouraged to consider both sides of the argument. And one example of this, and if we get back into order, so our outlook was the organisation's journal, and one example is the February 1912 edition of the association's magazine, Our Outlook, which had a regular feature entitled Conversations of the Day. And on this particular day, it allowed two women to discuss the suffrage, anti-suffrage point of view. It's worth noting that it was the suffrage, not the suffragette point of view, because militant action would not have been supported by the organisation. So I thought, just to give you a wee bit of flavour, you can actually look at this online. The MRC, the Modern Records Centre at the University of Warwick, has made some of its documents available digitally online, and this is one of them. But it is interesting. I mean, it kind of made me laugh when I read it again, just preparing for this. That even in 1912, the arguments of the person who was of the woman who's anti-suffrage were fairly weak and quite feeble. But you can sort of sense it. Maybe I'm just imagining a bit of an inherent bias. So you have two daughters, mother and daughter, Mrs. and Miss Elliot, who are asking questions of a pro-suffrage and an anti-suffrage campaigner. And just to give you a little flavour of what's in the journal, again, I'm reminding you it's from 1912. So Miss Smith, who's pro-suffrage, says to the two women, "Are you not British citizens with a great interest in the well-being of your country and a desire to help in promoting that welfare in any way you can? Do you not help to contribute to its upkeep by the taxes that you pay?" And then it goes on to say, as a widow, she's obviously a widow, and how she does her bit, so she has the right to vote. She also argues that up until now the laws have been made by men alone, and however good their intentions, they cannot always understand a woman's point of view. And then just finally from her, she says, "And you will still find in the laws concerning the relations of husband and wife fragments of the old and false idea that the wife is the property of the husband." So these are the pro-suffrage arguments. In response to that, there's also an argument about equal pay as well and how you need women there. So there's lots of really quite powerful arguments in favour of women being granted the parliamentary franchise. And then on the other hand, you have I think it's Miss Adam who's arguing against, and really the only argument she can come up with, and I really am skewing the evidence here, because you can read it for yourselves online. She says they don't have enough time. They're just too busy at home, and they don't have enough time to do it, and they really, I should read it out, but it's a bit like they shouldn't be bothering their little heads about it. But she says, so just a quote here, so to make a true home, because they don't have any time because they're housewives and need to be at home. So to make a true home, to train up God-fearing and healthy children is women's real work. And though this is not possible for every woman, yet each in her own sphere can bring comfort and gentleness and brightness to the lives of those around her. And I fear that in this struggle for, in quotes, rights, women are losing some of those graces which do so much to redeem life from ugliness, and are forgetting that it is more blessed to give than to receive. So that's the answer. And then the response to that by the pro-suffrage woman is that by having the vote, women can actually enhance life and get rid of some of the ugliness. So the debate goes on, and in the end, again, it's all very, well, I don't know if it's balanced or not, but they give advice of where to find more information from both the anti-suffrage and the suffrage point of view. So just to give you, I just wanted you to get a sense of really how seriously these issues are being discussed within the YWCA in 1912. So when the Representation of the People Act was passed in 1918, in which, as I'm sure you all know, extended the franchise to women over 30, the YW welcomed this reform, which might hint perhaps a sense of bias I can pick up in the earlier article. So they welcomed the reform as it recognised women's right to full political citizenship. Readers of our Outlook were informed in June 1918 that women's domestic role has given them both experience and unique qualities to participate in public life, thereby contradicting, I think, the arguments made in 1912 in their previous article. We should surely agree with Mrs. Fawcett, who was leader of the Suffragist Campaign, when she writes that the domestic experience of women is no bad preparation for the duties of citizenship, and a mother's love is no bad schooling for love of country. Members of the YWCA were encouraged to join their local Women's Citizens Association and I quote, never to vote for an unprincipled or immoral candidate, whatever his party. The Christian ethos of the YW was also clearly influenced the association's desire to encourage its members to vote and to participate actively in public life. Members were informed that our special aim should be to insist that all our life, political and economic, social and individual, shall be dominated by Christian principle and inspired by Christian ideals. The YW supported the extension of the franchise to women over 21 during the 1920s. However, once again, it was unwilling to campaign publicly side by side with overtly feminist groups, for example, the 6 Point Group or the Women's Freedom League, on the grounds that their equal rights feminist agenda was, once again, both too radical and too political. So despite attempts to reassure members that the YW could take an interest in political, economic and social questions whilst remaining non-party political and non-feminist, not all members were convinced. The Irish division believed that the religious aspect of the association's work was being neglected, and in May 1917 had withdrawn from the British Association to concentrate on evangelical work. And I did some work on its archives in Dublin many years ago, the very beginning of my PhD, so early 1990s. And they didn't engage in any kind of voluntary action that wasn't evangelical. So they could change the focus of their organisation in Ireland. A second split occurred in 1924 when the Scottish division broke away to form the autonomous YWCA of Scotland. As a result of these internal divisions, membership of the YWCA in England and Wales fell from 80,000 women in 1918 to 33,800 in 1926. It's clear from these early splits that the YWCA in England and Wales was determined to maintain its dual role as a religious organisation capable of providing a public voice for women and girls. This view was reiterated in 1938 when the report of the National General Secretary stated that the YW must be seen as more than just a club for girls. This was essential if the association was to be seen, and again I quote, as a women's movement. So for the rest of the paper, I'm focusing principally on the activities of the YW in England and Wales, and not in Ireland or Scotland. By 1930, it was reported that the association had succeeded in attracting over 1,000 new members, many of whom worked in business and the professions, but a small but keen element of leisured women and girls. Right, so where am I gone? 8. Okay. sorry, there we are. Physical education, sorry, I'm back on track. Thank goodness I put my page numbers on. Physical education classes, singing, handicrafts and dramatics were listed as the most popular subjects taught at YWCA centres. But it was also noted that classes in literature, history, economics and citizenship were becoming more popular. Religious education remained an important element of YWCA work during the interwar years, and this often encompassed Bible study classes, Sunday services, retreats and prayer circles, which were held regularly at local centres to encourage members to follow Christian teaching. The YW is perhaps best known for its network of residential hostels, and by the end of 1939 the organisation had opened 98 hostels and holiday homes for women in England and Wales. I don't know if has anyone ever stayed in one? I have. I stayed in one in Manchester years ago. I went to see University Challenge, and we stayed in. I was only in school. I was in the last year of school. It was very exciting to stay in the YW in Manchester. It was fun. Anyway, so these hostels were during the interwar years were important for providing women with accommodation as they moved into towns and cities for work. And this demand became even more urgent once war broke out in 1939 in order to provide accommodation for women moving for war work. And they just have a poster of this to give you a sense. This is an ad from 1940, just emphasising this important aspect of the YWCA's work. And it still is. I think there's a hostel on Tottenham Court Road. I think there's a YWCA, on Tottenham Court Road. So, membership of the YW during the interwar period included a number of well-known trade unionists, social workers and feminists. Edith Picton Turbeville, OBE, was vice president of the YWCA during the 1920s, and she was also a suffragist and a feminist who had worked as a missionary with the YW in India before the First World War. She was involved in a wide range of organisations and served on the executive of the National Council of Women, the Townswomen's Guilds, and the National Council for Equal Citizenship. Gertrude Tuckwell, JP, was Vice President of the YWCA's Industrial Law Bureau, and she was a former President of the Women's Trade Union League. This crossover in membership between the leadership of the YWCA and other influential women's groups is significant, but certainly not unique. It helps explain the close cooperation between organisations such as the YWCA and the National Council of Women in demanding social and economic reform to improve women's lives. Joint membership of a number of women's organisations also suggests a vibrant network of female activists who continued to work together after the suffrage for the welfare of women, despite the sometimes very different objectives of their individual organisations. So in my kind of broader work, I really do try to emphasise this networking that's going on, and that despite the fact you will have kind of public pronouncements, which I would argue were very tactical and strategic, of separating publicly the organisations. In terms of individual activity, there was an awful lot of close communication, and these groups deciding and choosing when and where to work together very effectively throughout these years. So in spite of its active involvement in a wide range of campaigns, its cooperation with other women's groups and the role played by trade unionists and feminists within the organisation, the YWCA remained consistent in its public rejection of party politics and equal rights feminism. The association's constitution confirmed that the YWCA shall take no side in party politics, but may, in its discretion, take action on questions affecting the welfare of women and girls. Any subject deemed too political, too feminist, or too divisive for its interdenominational membership was considered out of bounds for discussion by the organisation. And as a result, moral and political issues, and particularly moral issues such as divorce law reform, the legalisation of abortion, and the provision of birth control information were not debated by the YW during the interwar years. And that wasn't unusual. The Women's Institute, for example, was also a non-denominational organisation, and it didn't discuss those issues either for the same reasons. As I've already suggested, the fact that the YW sought to distance itself from party politics and egalitarian feminist societies shouldn't lead to the assumption, which I think has in the past been the case, that the organisation refused to engage in politics and public debate. On the contrary, The organisation was keenly aware of the importance of voluntary associations to a healthy democracy and the advantages that democratic citizenship could bring to women's lives. In common with other religious women's organisations, for example the Mothers' Union and the Catholic Women's League, the YW sought to promote the important contribution in particular that Christian women could make to society. This belief led the YW to join the March 1928 United Equal Franchise demonstration organised by the National Union of Societies for Equal Citizenship, where 50 members of the London YWCA attended, bringing with them their YW banner and shield to join the march. It's no surprise, therefore, that the YW celebrated the passing of the 1928 Equal Franchise Act as it finally signified in the YW's words that women were now in possession of the full political privileges of citizenship. So following the extension of the franchise to women in 1918 and 1928, women's organisations became increasingly concerned about the importance of educating women in citizenship so that they would use their new right to vote wisely. As Sue Innes has written, these groups included post-suffrage feminist pressure groups, trade union and professional bodies, the three main political parties, the Women's Co-operative Guild, as well as mainstream women's organisations. Innes argues convincingly that the idea of citizenship invigorated the women's movement at this time and enabled a synthesis of equality and social feminisms. As part of the wider women's movement, the YW was also preoccupied with educating its members in citizenship. Moreover, as a Christian women's organisation, the leadership of the YW firmly believed that it had a responsibility to ensure that members had an awareness of the political, economic and industrial questions. Delegates attending the 1928 York Conference were reminded of their responsibility for studying the duties of citizenship with a view to making a more intelligent use of the franchise. One way to do this is to study the laws affecting the welfare of women and girls, and to bring pressure to bear, not only nationally but locally, to secure legislation in the best interests of the community. Good citizenship was defined by the YW as the right ordering of our several loyalties to home and family, to church, school or college, political party, YWCA and other social movements. In 1929, it was noted that there was a desire amongst members for classes in subjects such as citizenship, economics and social study. As well as the formal classes, social service groups were set up to facilitate community work amongst the membership. For example, staffing play centres or organising parties at local hospitals. The link between citizenship and Christian faith was reiterated once again when it was made clear that education in citizenship and social work would encourage members to develop their powers and their lives to the fullest, a goal which the association considered an essential part of our Christian duty. In 1931, the annual report of the YWCA declared that all activities of a good YWCA centre, physical, educational, social and religious, constitute training for citizenship and should be so regarded. However, the association singled out the education of newly enfranchised women for special attention so that they too would take an intelligent and active interest in public affairs. Methods incorporated by the YW to ensure that members had some knowledge of and interest in political, social and economic problems were many and varied. Conferences, weekend study camps, lectures and study courses were organised by the association throughout the 1930s. A comparison of local centre activities during the years 1939 and 1946 revealed an increase of 128% of sustained group work in citizenship and education. That's the column there at the far end. Sorry, it's very hazy. So I didn't do this column. I never do graphs. This was done by the YWCA themselves. This was in comparison to an increase of 151% in drama, 31% in physical education and recreation, and a 27% increase in religious education. So it's clear, obviously, from the graph, you can see that at least, that the most popular is my own copy here, but I don't need that one, is the physical education and recreation, and perhaps that is one of the things we most associate with the YWCA, that kind of that social experience. But it is also, I think, worth noting that the increase in classes in citizenship, which I can label it, were increasing really quite significantly at this time. So the desire to instill in all members an awareness of the power of the vote, along with their obligation to contribute to the life of their community and to the nation, was coupled with the recognition that women as citizens were entitled to certain rights. As both a Christian organisation and an organisation for newly enfranchised women, the YW felt it was its responsibility to arouse the conscience of the community in order to secure basic rights and privileges for all citizens, and that included women. These rights included efficient health services, adequate housing, freedom from war and conflict, equal pay, and good working conditions. In order to secure these rights, the YW felt obliged to use its influence as a highly respected international organisation to engage in public debates and voluntary action. And it could be argued that the involvement of such a respected Christian women's organisation, representing some 42,000 women, was far more likely to win the attention of government than feminist pressure groups representing only a tiny minority of women. And one of the reasons why in the historiography assumptions in the past have been made that the women's movement went into a really steep decline in the interwar years was because of the very small memberships of groups like the 6 Point Group and the Women's Freedom League. But what hadn't been looked at was how the membership of other women's organisations like the YW, like the Mothers Union, like the Women's Institutes was actually increasing quite dramatically at this time. And they were influenced, they were part of the establishment, and they were listened to by government. So before I move on to evaluating the work of the YW in England and Wales with regards to working conditions for women and the Equal Pay Campaign, I want to first of all give you a very quick flavour of some of the other interests the association had during the years 1920 to 1945. Maternal mortality, the appointment of women police, and the creation of support networks for women serving in the armed services during the Second World War were three important areas of activity for the YW. And the YW also played a key role in the interwar peace movement. And I'm not going to say anything more about that because I'm actually giving a paper about that in January, but I need to do the research for it first. It was a kind of, I've touched on it, but I need to do a proper investigation. But they were very, very active in the interwar peace movement. And once again, though, have not been really included in histories of the interwar peace movement. So, in response to growing public concern about high rates of maternal mortality, Gertrude Tuckwell of the YWCA established the very influential Women's Maternal Mortality Committee in 1927, which throughout the late 20s and into the 1930s investigated and drew public attention to the alarming increase in death in childbirth during these years. Concerned in particular with the health and welfare of pregnant women, the committee's primary aim was to bring pressure to bear on government and local authorities to improve the quality and availability of healthcare for mothers and expectant mothers. The YW was an active member of this committee, working alongside the Mothers Union, the Women's Institutes, the Town's Women's Guilds, and the National Council of Women. And I think the reason I've kind of picked out on this particular campaign area is to demonstrate that the YW, although we tend to associate most as an organisation which is concerned with the welfare of young working girls, it's clear when you look more closely at its activities in the interwar years that it was really concerned with women much more generally, and here in particular with women when they were pregnant or shortly after giving birth. So the pressure because of the concerns about falling birth rates, the increase in maternal mortality did lead to some action in this area by government and local authorities. But I would argue that the continued pressure of these influential women's organisations also played its part. And in my book, which I meant to bring along to try and flog some more copies, but I forgot. Normally always have it with me. But anyway, I have a whole chapter on this, so if anyone's interested, you can ask me after. I'll tell you where to get it. So by 1938, the provision of maternity services had improved, with most local authorities in England providing antenatal and postnatal clinics, free of charge obviously for working class women. This success and the cooperation between women's groups to achieve this goal illustrates how the YW was part of a wider women's movement at this time, and not, as it was worried, just a club for girls. A second high-profile campaign in which the YW took an active part was the campaign for the appointment of women police. And this campaign began during the First World War. And it was here that the YWCA forged a strong working relationship with what was then known as the National Union of Women's Workers, later renamed the National Council of Women. The National Council of Women is an umbrella organisation for about 96 women's organisations throughout the interwar years. It's still obviously active today, and the YWCA was a member of the National Council of Women. So both groups, the National Council of Women and the YW, argued that women must be appointed to the police force to deal with women and children, ill, destitute, homeless, and those who had been victims of sexual offences or were believed to be in danger of drifting towards an immoral life. The success of voluntary police patrols during the First World War resulted in the establishment of a women's police force by the London Metropolitan Police in 1918, the first of its kind in the UK. Despite this achievement, the appointment of female police officers was frustratingly slow, and the principal objection was local chief constables just did not want to appoint women to their police forces, so they just didn't, because they had that autonomy at the time. By 1939, only 45 out of 183 police forces in England and Wales had policewomen amongst their ranks. So throughout the interwar years, the YWCA, working closely with the National Council of Women, and other women's groups, including the Women's Institutes and the Mothers' Union, persistently lobbied the Home Office and local police authorities to implement this change, i.e. the appointment of more women police. With the outbreak of war, this pressure was increased, and success finally came in 1944 when the Home Secretary issued a circular to chief constables advising them that women police should be appointed to all local constabularies. But even into the 1960s, there are very low numbers of women police being appointed. But the YW did play a key part in that campaign. So the Second World War provided the YWCA with another opportunity to demonstrate its willingness to publicly support the welfare of women in society. Just as it had done in the First World War, the association opened huts, canteens and hostels for men and women serving in the military. As thousands of women volunteered, the YW set up temporary clubs at their military camps. The huts provided recruits with a common room of their own and a space where they could relax, read, smoke and chat. As well as providing some much needed R&R, the YWCA leadership felt that the huts provided, and I quote, the feminine touch for women working in a traditionally male environment. Women who were posted to isolated camps or at anti-aircraft stations were visited by YWCA volunteers in mobile club vans, which sold lipstick, soap, chocolate and cigarettes, I quote, which were clearly deemed to be the essentials of life for women on army camps. And I just have an image here. So on the right, the image on the side there is just saying the postman brings her a letter from home, but the YWCA gives her a home from home, and they're looking to asking for fundraising in order to be able to continue doing that. And then the second image is, sorry it's so blurry, but you can see they're queuing up for their fags and their lippy. I did try and scrutinise and see. I mean, it looks like there's a dagon of gin there, but I don't think it is. I think it might be perfume or something. But this I just love the idea that they felt that this, sort of part of kind of humanising, in a sense, or feminising the war experience by providing these services to women. So I'm going to turn now to look at and spend a little bit more time just looking at the involvement of the organisation in trying to improve working conditions for women workers and the Equal Pay Campaign. So throughout the interwar years, the YWCA took an active interest in working conditions for female employees, just as it had done since its foundation. In 1921, the association set up an Industrial Law Bureau to explain, enforce and extend social and industrial legislation relating to women workers. The Bureau investigated complaints from women about poor working conditions and health insurance claims and made representations on their behalf to the relevant authorities. One example of the Industrial Law Bureau's work from 1928 was case number 643, in which a firm of French polishers had been reported to the YWCA, to factory inspectors, for compelling women to work 8 hours on a Saturday with no break. Following a factory inspection, which was instigated by the YWCA's complaint, the workers were given a half an hour break for tea. And I think that wasn't great, but at least it was something. The Bureau also supplied speakers to various women's organisations, so they very much presented themselves as expert on industrial law and labour law with regards to women at this time. And the organisations that their speakers were sent to included the Labour Party women's sections and the Women's Co-operative Guild to discuss labour law and how it affected female workers. The YWCA's annual review of 1929 reported on the work of the Industrial Law Bureau and demonstrated how the Bureau engaged in casework to ensure that employers were conforming to employment law. For example, the Trade Board Acts, Shop Acts and Insurance Acts. And unsurprisingly, the legislation that they were most interested in was the areas and the occupational sectors where you were most likely to find female workers, and particularly young women working, like the shops, for example. The Bureau also assisted women workers who wished to make claims under the terms of the Workmen's Compensation Act. An example was given of a female laundry worker injured when her hand was caught in a machine. Her employers initially offered her £10 in full settlement, but having consulted the YWCA and its Industrial Law Bureau, she was awarded her full weekly salary for 6 months and a lump sum of £15. So, a significant improvement than had she not had that support from the YW. In addition to its casework, the Bureau also provided women with advice regarding the National Health Insurance Act and eligibility for widows and old age pensions, again important issues in the years following the First World War. The YWCA's concern about the working conditions of women and girls resulted in active participation in campaign work. Despite its reluctance to engage with political organisations, the association had no qualms about lobbying MPs or actively campaigning for legislative reforms aimed at improving the working conditions of women. In 1934, a new Parliamentary and Public Affairs Committee was set up to advise the association on legislation and other public questions affecting the welfare of women and girls. So one of the ways that the YWCA sought to improve the welfare of women and girls was to campaign for equal pay in both the private and public sectors throughout the interwar years and during the Second World War. The Equal Pay Campaign has been well documented by a number of historians, most notably perhaps Harold Smith, but the contribution of the YWCA, along with other voluntary women's groups such as the Women's Institutes and the National Council of Women, has tended to be overlooked. You can see there's a pattern emerging here. The involvement of the YWCA in the Equal Pay Campaign dates back to the end of the First World War, when its Social and Legislative Committee passed a resolution calling for equal pay for equal work. And what's particularly notable about the involvement of the YW in this campaign is that they are one of the few groups which focused on private the private sector. So there was a tendency to, and that continued right up to the introduction of equal pay in the 1950s, to focus the campaign on the public sector, on the civil service and on teaching. But the YW was one of the few groups which really focused on the needs of women working in the private sector. And I think that is interesting and warrants further historical attention. So working with other women's organisations, once again, in particular the National Council of Women, the YWCA consistently highlighted the impact that low pay had on women workers throughout the interwar years. And again, it's not surprising because these are the women that the organisation is interacting with all of the time. These are the women that are staying in its hostels. They are the women who are going to it seeking help when, for example, their hand gets caught in a machine and their employers are trying to fob them off with a unfair compensation. So, as I've said, what's interesting is that whilst groups such as the National Union of Women Teachers and the National Association of Civil Servants focused on the implementation of equal pay in the public sector, the YW was steadfast in its desire to champion the cause of women working in the private sector. In 1933, its executive argued that low wages for women would result in a general reduction in wage rates for both men and women, in a unfortunately failed attempt to bring the male-dominated trade unions into the Equal Pay Campaign. There was always this sense that women's wages would undercut men's. And if women had equal pay, then all pay rates would come down. During the 1930s, significant numbers of young women found employment in new light industries, where the work was unskilled and low paid. In 1935, women's average earnings in industry were between 37.3 and 55.9% of the wage paid to male workers, which always makes me feel a bit better when I look at the gender pay gap today, which is around 16%. At least it's got a bit better, but not perfect, obviously. And so that year, with 1935, the National Council of Women condemned the fact that women working in the clothing and textile industries received lower rates of pay than men. One member of the council's executive described this situation as a scandal, suggesting that the whole status of women is kept down by inequality of pay and opportunity. In spite of the continued efforts of campaigners, equal pay in both the private and public sectors remained an elusive goal throughout the 1930s. The outbreak of war in September 1939 and the recruitment of significant numbers of additional women into the armed services and into the workforce provided women's organisations with a new opportunity to highlight the inequalities in pay and conditions long experienced by women workers. In May 1941, the YWCA joined the debate by highlighting the injustice behind the decision to pay unskilled women working in the transport and engineering industries, where significant numbers of women were required because men working in those fields had gone into the army, but they were being paid significantly less than unskilled men. The YWCA's desire to assert the rights of married women workers even extended to their public criticism of the popular wartime slogan, "Be like Dad, keep mum." And some of you may not be familiar, but the term "keep mum" means to not give away secrets, to stay quiet. So to be like Dad, keep mum. In 1941, the slogan was condemned as offensive in News for Citizens, the YWCA's newsletter, for suggesting, and I quote, that married women should be kept rather than earn their living by war work. And it's worth noting here that Martin Pugh stated in his history of the women's movement that no criticism of this slogan was ever made during the war, but he was wrong, because the YWCA did complain about it. So I think this is another glaring example of how this organisation has been omitted from key historical accounts. I like these two images. So one image is the poster itself, and then there's this photograph I just found on Google Image, but it's a big written sign, but I just would love to think what that woman's thinking as she stares at the sign. Does she think it's offensive, or is she just okay with it? Who knows? We'll never know. We just see the back of her head. So any hopes women's groups had that equal pay for equal work would be introduced during the war were crushed in 1943, when the Chancellor for the Exchequer made it clear that the government had no intention of changing its position on equal pay. This was a major blow to women's groups who, in the words of the National Council of Women, had argued since the outbreak of war that it would be far better and more just to give women the proper rate for the job. Responding to the continued unwillingness of the government to introduce equal pay rates, the Equal Pay Campaign Committee was set up in January 1944 to coordinate the work of women's societies campaigning for equal pay. There's some images there. Although not a member of the Equal Pay Campaign Committee, on the grounds that it was a political pressure group, so it's interesting to see that this is a consistent policy on the part of the YWCA. They really do think carefully about the organisations which they are willing to cooperate openly with, for example, the National Council of Women, and then other groups like the Equal Pay Campaign Committee. Although they agreed completely with its objective, they didn't feel that they could join the committee as an active member. So the YWCA didn't join the organisation. I think there was about 43. The Women's Institutes did. So different groups are making different decisions, kind of for the same reason. So it is really quite interesting. The WI do join. The YWCA doesn't join, but it supports the objective from outside the committee. So the YWCA supports the work of the committee through its membership of the National Council of Women. And continue to demand equal pay for women in the private sector in particular. Following extensive lobbying on the part of the Equal Pay Campaign Committee, working with extensive lobbying on the part of the Equal Pay Campaign Committee, an amendment on equal pay was successfully passed during the Commons debate on the 1944 Education Bill. However, and again I'm sure many of you are aware and very familiar with the fact that Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister, called a vote of no confidence in the government, thereby ensuring that support for the Equal Pay Amendment was squashed. So the controversy surrounding the equal pay debate in the Commons did result in the establishment of a Royal Commission on Equal Pay in 1944. The Royal Commission reported in October 1946, and it provided a stark account of the inequalities in pay in both the public and private sectors. Following the publication of this report, the YWCA called on the post-war Labour government to introduce equal pay without delay. Such hopes were, however, dashed once again when the post-war Labour government, announced in June 1947 that it would not support the introduction of equal pay in the public service on the grounds that it would be wholly inflationary in its results. The Equal Pay Campaign Committee continued its campaign work throughout the immediate post-war years, supported by a wide range of women's organisations, until 1954, when the Conservative government finally announced that it would introduce equal pay, first in the teaching profession and then gradually throughout the civil service. Although falling short of the YWCA's demand that all women workers were entitled to be paid a fair rate for the job, the introduction of equal pay in the public sector represented a significant victory for the YWCA and the women's movement in the 1950s, which is another decade that in the standard historiography the women's movement is seen to have fallen. Often it's seen as the nadir and a complete fallen into abeyance, and they're wrong, it didn't. So, speaking in 1928, just to go back a decade or two, in 1928 the feminist campaigner Marjorie Corbett Ashby described the YWCA as a vital part of the women's movement, bringing to it the great contribution of Christianity with its ideal of self-sacrificing service. Like Corbett Ashby, the YWCA regarded itself as part of a vibrant women's movement, working alongside other women's groups to enhance the status of women in the decades following enfranchisement. Its commitment to the education of women citizens, its aim to encourage women to participate in public life, and its willingness to campaign for legislative reforms to improve the daily lives of women all indicate that the YWCA has always been a part of the British women's movement. Thank you.